Hello everybody. In my last video I talked about the traditional names for chords. They would call the 3-note chord a triad and the 4-note chord a seventh. Well, I call mine 5th chords, 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th and 13th chords. These are my System 2000 bass chords. Now, these chords are in the key of F, just so I can fit everything on there. But if you show some chords in the key of C, which I did earlier, you'd see that my 5th chords, well, these are the bass chords, the 5th chords. C major, C minor, C diminished, C augmented. We talked about that a little bit. Then I showed you my bass chords, the 7ths, and I showed the C major 7, C minor 7, C diminished 7, C augmented 7, and C dominant 7. I talked about that a little bit. Now, the other bass chords, the bigger chords in my system, well, these are called the 9th chords because the highest tone in the chord is the 9th. And these are called 11th bass chords because the highest note in each 11th chord is an 11th. And then I have 13th chords too, which I don't need to show you because it's just the same as these, only there's an extra note placed above the 11th. So I don't need to show you that. It's too cluttered anyway. So here's the 9th bass chords and the 11th bass chords. Now I wanted to go back very quickly, just quickly, and talk about this mess that I had with my C augmented 7th chord. That's the one that had from your root to your highest note that had 11 half steps. We talked about that. And I showed you why I don't use the augmented 7th, because here, if you had an augmented C augmented 7 with an actual augmented 7th, all right, you'd have 12 half steps, and essentially this B sharp would be a C, like I mentioned, and you'd have a perfect 8th or an octave, which is the same as an augmented 7th. And I don't like that. I don't want that because that's confusing and it's just not neat. So I talked about that. Now, one more thing I want to say about keeping the augmented 7th, or any augmented chord in my system is because the nature of the symbol itself. Now I showed you the symbol itself, the actual symbol. You waited a year and a half to see it. And here's another one of my symbols. This is a System 2000 chord symbol. So here's your root tone. That's real big, the C. That's your root tone. And this is the type indicator. This indicates the type of chord. Talk about that in a minute. This indicates the size. This is the size indicator. It indicates the size of the bass chord. That's the 7. And then up here you have your modifiers. And there might be several modifiers. It all depends on the chord that you choose. But I put the modifiers up here. And if you remember, I talked about how I use the term specifier instead of accidentals. I call sharps, flats, and the natural sign, double sharp, double flats. I call them specifiers. But I still call these modifiers because they're modifying the bass chord. All right? Whereas specifiers specifically designate which note, which precise note you're using. So there's a little difference there. These are modifiers which modify the bass chord symbol, and that's why I call them that. Now, you see how I have this arranged in typography. If you had a particular font, let's say you had Arial or Helvetica or whatever, you would have the top line would be called the cap line, and the middle line would be called the mean line, and the bottom line would be called the bass line. So you see how my symbol fits in these typographical imaginary lines. Your root takes up the whole space here between the cap and the bass line. And then your type indicator sits in between the cap and the mean line. And the size indicator sits in between the mean and the bass line. That's just a little thing I wanted to show you. Now, if you use the linear alphanumeric way of writing it, which I don't care for, but I had to throw this in, and I'll tell you why in a minute. It would look like this. You have your root, your type indicator, your size indicator, a point. It's not a dot like they tell you on Google.com. It's not a dot. I don't know why they talk like that. It's stupid. And then you have your modifier, or you can have multiple modifiers. We'll talk about that in upcoming videos. And I show you that because when I kept the augmented 7 chord in my system, and the augmented 9, and the augmented 11, and the augmented 13, I did that specifically so that we would have a bass chord with an augmented 5th already included. See, that way you don't have to modify the 5th. It's already included. So keeping the augmented 7, augmented 9, augmented 11, or augmented 13 is basically a convenience. It's just a convenience because the most commonly augmented note in a chord or a scale is the 5th. So I just kept it in my system, and I'm happy with that. Now, getting back to the bass chords, I showed you for the first time my bass chords, the ninth bass chords. They're called ninth because the highest tone, highest note in the chord is a ninth. Now, you'll see here the major 9. I use the key of C because that's easy. Most beginners know the key of C. Then you have the C minor 9, and C diminished 9, C augmented 9, which I just mentioned. The augmented 5th is there as a convenience. All right, just a convenience. That's all. And then your C dominant 9, because you got your dominant 7. It's a minor 7, but actually it's dominant. I already explained that. It's in the harmonic series. It's a powerful thing. But now, if you go back a minute, you say, if you're really paying attention, you say, oh, wait a second, what's this? C dominant 9 bass chord. Why would you need that? Because you would notice here you would see the D double flat. You see, and that could be a problem. Well, yes and no. So let me quickly explain that. Here's why I justify keeping the C dominant 9th chord in my system, though I keep it reluctantly. Remember, I kept the augmented chords reluctantly, but I'm keeping this even more reluctantly. And if I had to do my book over again, I might exclude it. The problem is, in this chord you have your root, you have your E flat, your G flat, now it's in the key of C, then you have your B double flat, and you have your D double flat, which is essentially the same, and harmonically the same as a C. And you say, well, Joey, after what you told us previously, that sounds like a bit of a contradiction. It does. So this chord, the C diminished 9, is essentially the same as a C diminished. That's a 5th chord. I don't have the 5 underneath because you don't need it. We'll talk about that later. But that's essentially a C diminished chord with an added minor 6. Okay, it's a C diminished. That's a 5th chord with an added major 6th. Now that's a modifier like I just showed you. Now using the linear alphanumeric option that I include, which I don't really care for, but I have to have it, you would write that C with the diminished symbol 0.6. So that's how you get that. We're going to talk about this later, and it'll become crystal clear. But for now, I'm just going over things that you might think are contradictions. You might say, "Hey, I'm paying attention, and I don't like what you're telling me here." So, once again, very briefly, this is where we're going to start, and this will be the basis for our next videos and the basis for my whole system. Your 5th bass chords, your 7th bass chords, all right, your 9th bass chords, and your 11th bass chords. And I'm not showing the 13s because they're too big and clunky, but here's something I do want to show you. You see the C diminished 11. I didn't even bother putting the flat symbols in here. I didn't even bother because there's no need. It's impractical and stupid to have a C diminished 11 or a C diminished 13. So I don't have it in my system. It's just silly. So you see, I didn't even bother writing the flat signs in there, the specifiers, because you just don't need it. Okay, so I wanted to make that clear. Now, the bass chords, if it's a 5th chord, all right, if it's a 5th chord, you don't need to write the 5 in the size indicator position because it's a given. You see that blank space, you say, oh, that's a 5th chord. That's just a basic, simple 5th chord. So here's your graphic representation of my symbol, and here's your linear alphanumeric. Now you see that's a 5th chord because the size indicator is not needed. It's given. It's assumed. And then here for your C minor, this is a 5th chord. Graphic, linear alphanumeric. And then your C diminished, graphic, linear alphanumeric. Then your C augmented, graphic, and linear alphanumeric. You know, when you type these in, these linear alphanumerics, when you type them in on your computer, this plus sign's going to be bigger. And your diminished symbol might be just a little bit bigger. But I think you get the point. And then for your bass chords, your 7 chords, let's say your 7th chords, bass chords, you would have your graphic. Now you see the size indicator is indicated because it's not given, it's not assumed. Then here's your linear alphanumeric, C minor 7, C diminished 7, C augmented 7, which I talked about at length. Told you, kept this in as a convenience. Why? Because when I say C augmented 7 in my system, I'm saying that it's a C augmented 7 bass chord. It's not this symbol. This is the type indicator, and this is the size indicator. It's not telling you that the 7th is augmented. It's not telling you that. It's just telling you that this is an augmented type of chord, and the size is the 7th. The highest note in this bass chord is the 7th. Now, if you had like a +7 over here, a modifier, then you'd have an actual augmented 7 interval, which I don't use anyway. So you see why I made that clear? C augmented is the type, 7 is the size. It's that simple. Then here's the C dominant 7. I talked about that at length. Don't need to go on and on. Now, when you, if somebody would say, hey, I really like this chord symbol, I'm actually going to use it, then if you had music software, like music notation software like Finale, Sibelius, or if you had Adobe InDesign, if you had page layout software where you could place objects exactly where you want them, you could easily put this symbol in there. If you had page layout software, you could put this symbol in, all right? But if you don't have that and you have to just type it in on a regular keyboard, a regular computer keyboard, you could use the linear alphanumeric, and you would type in the C, capital M, the 7, point, and then you'd have a, I use lowercase o, letter O for this diminished symbol. I use a lowercase o, which might be a little bit bigger, and of course your 5 would be bigger. But you can play with that if you like the system. And that's about it. Okay, sorry it took so long, but the next time I come back I want to try to get to the whiteboard so I can stand and look at example chords specifically. Really look at them, tear them apart, put them back together, and see if you like it. That's it. Thank you for being patient, and I hope to see you again.